some things like tonight, but we do mainly just that. So. Okay, what else? Anybody else? Last time? Okay, let's stand. Brother Doug, lead us in our opening prayer, please.
Heavenly Father, we come to you tonight, the sanctuary, to seek more knowledge of you, Lord, to grow closer to you, to continue on our never-ending journey to be more like you. Lord, you heard our prayer request, Lord. You know these situations. This is all in your control, Lord. I just pray that your will be done and that hearts are touched by whatever may be happening, Lord. That people are strengthened in you, that the lost are found, and that you just bless those who are going through trial and use that trial to your glory, Lord. It's just in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen. Marcia, you don't know, there's a new name written down in glory, and it's mine. Oh, yes, it's mine. That's what that verse in Revelation is talking about, when you get a new name. Marcia was, go ahead, sit down. Marcia was asking me about, Marcia was asking me about, because the other night I mentioned we get a new name, and it's a special name. And I've tried to figure out what the name might be. And I think it'll have something to do with what we've done for the Lord and our rewards. It'll say, it's going to be special between us and Him. And I think it'll say something about who we are in Him. So.
Yeah, it's a mystery that we're all going to be one in Jesus, yet we're going to have heightened individuality when we get to heaven, because we will have a special name written on the stone that no one knows but you and the Lord.
And you know what that stone is? That white stone where your name will be written? Do you know what that white stone represents? In Roman athletic events, when you were a winner, they gave you a little white stone, and you know what you did with that white stone? You took it to the awards banquet, and it was your ticket to get in. That's a ticket to get in. Pretty rich symbolism used by John there to let us know what it's all about. So we're in Exodus. I've already, see, that's not taking me long. I've already got all the way through Genesis. And Exodus is more than just a narrative about the way, about getting out of Egypt. It's really it's a confession of faith about the origins of God's chosen people, about the nation Israel, in fact. And how many of you know the name Leon Uris? U-R-I-S.
Yeah.
He wrote...
Exodus.
Yes, he wrote the book Exodus. And Exodus was made into a film. Yeah. And Leon Uris said this. Who was the star?
With a great theme song.
I don't remember.
This land is mine. This land me.
And what he wrote was, this night is different. This is what he wrote in that book. This is the ending line in that book. This night is different, referring to the night of the Exodus, because we celebrate the most important moment in the history of our people. He's a Jew. On this night, we celebrate their going forth in triumph from slavery into freedom. Okay? F.F. Bruce is a very well-known commentarian, especially on the Old Testament, says that he believes that if God's chosen people hadn't left Egypt within a couple of generations, when they did, they would have lost their identity. They were already beginning to crumble around the edges. They were losing some of their uniqueness. They were losing some of their abilities to function cohesively as a people. even in slavery. So it was God's timing, and God's timing, as always, was perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I've got a chart in there with Israel on one side and Egypt on the other. And, around 1700, a little before 1700, Egypt was dominated by foreigners. I mentioned that last week. The Hyksos or Hyksos, depending on how you see it, Hykos. And that word means foreigners. There were foreigners, interlopers in the land of Egypt that actually came in and occupied part of the land of Egypt, okay? And, but not long, as they occupied part of Egypt, the influx of Israel began to happen, where the people from what we would consider to be the Jewish race started to be introduced in Egypt. And they were introduced how? Originally by Joseph, okay? His family came. During that famine, quite a few people came. Some never went home, okay? They were brought as prisoners of war, because they had a habit of getting beat up a lot. Some of them just migrated there because they felt the conditions were better. But as they became a more separate people, during this time, around 1700, they became to be oppressed people, okay? And they were mainly used in the construction trade. As you see in the movies, a lot of them were used for to make bricks, and then the women and stuff were used as to work in the homes. And the Egyptians did that with quite a few people. But Egypt then, during this time, as the real oppression of the Jews begins around 1550 BC, Egypt is the most powerful country in the world, okay? It's what, all civilizations have their golden age, all right? I don't know how historians will characterize America. Our golden age might be from 1940, I don't know, after we came out of the Depression, to maybe, I don't know, 1990, I don't know, 2000, whatever. But for the Egyptians, this was a time, for about a 350-year span, they were really the top dogs of the world, and their literature, their art, their ability to build. They became fascinated with the idea of improving their physical ability by exercise and things like that. That was kind of a new idea back in those days. So they became sport-oriented, and so during this time, all these things flourished, and at the same time, we have the oppression of God's chosen people. And during this time also, see, Egypt actually went all the way, extended its power all the way over into the Fertile Crescent, all the way over into far western Asia. They were blessed because they had a group of leaders, emperors, pharaohs, one after another, that were all good militarily. They were all aggressive, and they were all served with enthusiasm. None of them were slackers. We're going to talk about that Sunday morning, where it says in Romans 9 that we're supposed to be of due diligence about doing God's work, especially in the family of God. God wants you to be enthusiastic about what you do. So the Egyptians refined the chariots that they had taken from the Hyksos, the foreigners. They refined that, and they were able to build composite bows. You're familiar with a composite bow? The idea that you have layers of wood. And what does that do with a bow? Makes it much stronger. And so they were able to militarily dominate most of their enemies. So they were able to stretch their influence all the way over into what is today, present-day Iraq. Okay, and but by around the 14th century, the 1300s, they begin to fall apart, and their main issue in their decline is the issue of religion. They have a new pharaoh who believes in the idea that there's one God. It's not the Jewish God, but it's the God. It was called the cult of Aten, and Aten was you see Aten depicted in a picture of the sun, a solar disk. Of course, the regular Egyptians had numerous gods. Okay, and with this new pharaoh, he was at conflict with the high priest in his own country. The country ended up with two different capitals, all right? And there was really revolution throughout the land. There were factions fighting each other. So this new pharaoh was very unpopular with the people, and with his unpopularity, his power weakened, and the nation's power outside of what we would call Egypt today weakened. So over where their extended lands were, way over in the Mesopotamian Valley, in the area of Palestine, all of those areas, all of those people were revolting against Egypt. So, and there became other nations that began to rise up against her, and for many years, Egypt's greatest resource was her reputation. Okay, so there was a series. When we think of the pharaoh, who was the pharaoh during the time of Moses? Ramses. Yeah, and it was during this time. That was right at the end of their prosperity. Okay, and then after that. That was one sign of their weakness, that the Jews, that portrayed a picture to other people that they were a weak nation, okay? Because other people didn't understand the hand of God. So, so after they fought with a group of people called the Hittites. You've heard of the Hittites before? During this, the Hittites were able to essentially defeat them, but the Hittites only lasted for about 100 years. Their civilization rose very quickly and then fell. But in Canaan, during this time, there were really two types of people. There were the Canaanites and the Amorites, okay? And the Canaanites lived predominantly along the coastline, and the Amorites then lived up in the mountain area. And one thing, we think of the Jewish people being a pure race. But if you went to Israel, what would you see?
Mixed multitude.
Yeah, you would see black Jews. You would see blonde-haired Jews. You would see brown-haired Jews. You would see a multitude of people. So the people that occupied that part of the world were very diverse. The Hittites, the Hivites, the Horites, the Jebusites, the popular joke is the termites. All of these groups, none of whom were Semitic in nature, none of whom were Jewish, but they were all part of the population of Canaan. And what happened is, as these people molded together, they developed a common culture, all right? And that culture is reflected in their religion. They ended up being able to build well-built cities with good fortifications. They were able to build drainage systems, water supply systems. The society was much like it was very feudal in nature, like city-states, like in the Dark Ages. You had like a big boss, and everybody worked for the big boss. Everybody, he had his hierarchy, he had his soldiers, and everybody gave to the big boss. And this part of the world was famous for its timber. There were once great forests in this part of the world, in that part of the world. Purple dye, the purple dye industry was big in this part of the world. They were good with ceramics. They were good at copper mining. They were, for their time, they were pretty advanced people. The Canaanites, we kind of think of them as, kind of not real bright and stuff, but they were, and they were pretty advanced in their writing. And you can read a lot of Canaanite things that they wrote and get something from it. And but their religion was a religion that was quite, I guess the word would be debasing. The head of their pantheon, do you know what a pantheon is?
Multi-gods.
Fabio?
Multiple gods.
Yeah, their pantheon is their picture of their gods. That's why the temple on the Acropolis in Athens is the Parthenon. That's the Greek equivalent of a pantheon. Pantheon is really Latin. It's just their god structure, kind of like what Gordy said. It gives you the picture of who their gods are. They had their major god was named El. E-L. Okay? Okay, before the Jews came in and conquered them, their major god was named El. But he's a much different god than the Jewish god of El. He's a god who's kind of like, he lives up in the mountains where the rivers begin. And he's kind of a happy guy, and he doesn't have much to do with people, and if you're able to ask him for anything, he'll give it to you, but it's real hard to ask him for anything. He's kind of almost like a cartoon figure, character. But underneath him, then, you have some other gods that you're kind of familiar with. The first one, so this first god, El, is kind of inactive. The first really active god is a god named Baal. And Baal's a different kind of character. Baal controls the rain. And thus, because he controls the rain, he controls the vegetation. And his home, Baal lives far up in the north on a mountain, is the legend. And he rules all the other gods. And then he has a group of female deities. El has a wife who's called Ashereth, who bore him a family of 70 gods. Okay? And then and their main, remember one of the problems that the Hebrews had? They used to go and worship where? In the Old Testament? They got in trouble for going to the high places. And that's the places of Baal. It might be a tree. It might be like a totem. But there were these designated areas where they went to worship, where the presence of this god was supposed to be. Baal had a wife called Anat, and she was the goddess of love and war, and there's stories about her, how she got mad with a bunch of people in a temple one time and killed everybody, and their blood comes up to her chin, and she laughs and has a great time. And so they're not quite like the god that we know. Their gods are, you know who their gods are just like? They're just like people. Yeah, you know why? Because they made them up. So they're going to be just like people. Yeah, they come from their minds. So, and then a lot of emphasis on death and resurrection, nature, a lot of rituals, a lot of temple prostitution, a lot of immorality, idolatry, etc., involved in their religion. And as I said, usually their places of worship were up on hills. So the politics of this part of the world, they didn't really have a national identity. When we say Canaanite, when you talk about Canaan, there was a lot of different people in Canaan, okay? There's not really a Canaanite nationality. So it was like city-states, like I said earlier. Whoever had the greatest amount of soldiers occupied the most area, okay? And Canaan during this time is definitely part of Egypt's territory. Egypt dominates this area until later, until their time of weakness. Now, when you take into consideration what is written in Exodus, does it match? Is it accurate historically? So the first thing that we see in Exodus is, about the first 10 or 11 chapters, is the bondage of the Jewish people, okay? And remember, as you open the book of Exodus, who's the last significant figure that you saw in the book of Genesis? Joseph. And there's been quite a time frame, a lapse, since Joseph's time, okay? Probably 3, maybe even 400 years. So here we begin Exodus, and we begin with speaking about the bondage of the Jewish people. And when you look at that, there's a lot of support for this bondage being true, okay? A lot of writing. Most civilizations don't write about themselves being held in bondages, because they just don't want you to know. A lot of Moses, that's an Egyptian name. A lot of the Phineas, a lot of the names you read attributed to Jewish characters in Exodus are Egyptian names because of the influence of their society. How long were the God's people there? We consider it to be a 400-year period, okay? So they were there for a long time. And then, so you begin with this, the idea that Exodus begins speaking to the condition of the Jewish people. And then right as you begin, and then in the second chapter, it begins to speak about God's preparation for their deliverance, okay? We find Moses comes on the scene. And what was Moses, really? What would you, if you had to give Moses a title, what would be his title? Deliverer. What else? He spoke for God. Who speaks for God? Prophets. That's what I was looking for. Deliverer is good, but prophet is what I was looking for. He was a prophet. His influence on a national people, on a national scale, was as great as anybody's influence. As I said earlier, the Jewish men had been placed into this thing where they actually, how they made bricks? They pulled mud out of the Nile and they beat it with these sticks called mattocks, and then they had to cut straw, and they mixed that all together with sand, okay, and then they would put it in molds, and they would fill up these molds and flatten out the tops and let the molds dry in the sun. Very, very difficult work, okay? So as you begin to look, so then you get to meet Moses in Exodus, you get to meet Pharaoh, and then as you get into chapter 6, you get into the conflict of Moses, who represents God, and Pharaoh, who represents evil, their conflict, okay? And the manifestations of the miracles, you can read some commentarians that will tell you that those are all natural miracles that were generated by the Nile River and this and that, and when the frogs died, it did this, and then that made the flies come because all the frogs were dead, and la-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da. But, of course, what really happened is that God took a piece just smacked him upside the head, and so that he could, and the idea is that it would speak to Pharaoh, that Pharaoh would come to a reckoning, but he never does. Now, when you actually look in the Egyptian writings for evidence of the Exodus, there isn't any. You know why? Because they don't want you to know about all those Jewish slaves getting away. They're ashamed. They were ashamed of it. You can find writings outside of Egypt. Yes, Gordy?
Yeah, in general, the victors write the history books. If you
Yeah.
lost, say you don't get to write much.
Yeah. So, and this is what John Bright said. He said, we should as little expect an account of the Exodus in the Egyptian annals as we would find a description of Passion Week in the annals of Caesar. Because really, Jesus overthrew the Roman Empire. You know that, don't you? Really, he defeated the Roman Empire. It took about 300 years, but he defeated the Roman Empire. So you don't find, the only writings you find are those of Josephus. And who was Josephus? He was a Jewish Roman historian. But in the writings of the emperor, you won't really find anything about the Passion Week. And it's the same way with the Exodus, because when nations lose their way, they don't like anybody to know about it. But the only thing is, everybody knows about it. So all of these people then, so now you come to the part of where did they go? How did they go? The highly critical, who are high critics? Critics are those that try to disprove the Bible. High critics are those that try to disprove the Bible by showing the disparities between manuscripts and writings. The high critics will say, well, they didn't even cross the Red Sea. They crossed the Reed Sea. Okay? There was a sea called the Reed Sea, but it makes no sense to say that they would have gone that way. In fact, to get to the Reed Sea, they would have to pass some Roman garrisons on the way, so I imagine that they would have avoided those things. The conjecture, and I've got, I don't know how many Bibles in my office, and I've looked for the route of the Exodus in different ones, and they're different routes. It's just conjecture. We know some of what they did by some of the descriptions of places they were at, but it's really hard to figure out just where they traveled. And there's even some debate about when they traveled. I think they traveled around 1280 BC, all right? Others think it could have been early as 1445 BC. But I think the condition of Egypt, the condition of the people, there are things, Acts 7:6 speaks about 12 generations, I believe that's the reference. There's other things that would indicate to me that it's probably closer to 1300. So Moses, during this time, it's obvious that Moses and Aaron were easily able to gain access to Pharaoh's court, okay? That would be an indicator. Ramses was noted for that kind of behavior. The Hebrews labored. Ramses did a lot of building projects. The Hebrews labored predominantly in a city called Avaris, which is the new capital of Ramses. So as you look at that, it just seems to me that's a good jumping off point. How many Jews were there? Well, if I look at Numbers 146 and 2651, I have to figure, I figure that there was about 600,000 men. That's a lot of guys. That's not counting the women or the children. Now, I've read other guys that said there were 3,500. They said there couldn't be 6,000 men. If they did, they would stretch all the way from Egypt to Palestine. Well, that's not even, I don't even know where they get that idea. But I think that the closest we can guess, the best estimate we can make is is about 600,000 men, and then of course their families. And there's some opportunity for mistranslation in some of the Bible as far as the Hebrew as it comes forward, but I still think by this time in history there were a considerable amount of people. So the Exodus again wasn't really about freeing a group of people. It was about creating a new nation on the earth, God's people. God was fulfilling his covenant with Abraham. Okay, and even in their oppression in Egypt, the Hebrews learned good lessons from the Hebrews. They learned, the Egyptians. The Hebrews learned good things from the Egyptians. They learned about how to fight better, how to. They learned some things about how to put together your military. They learned things about the arts, which they were able to use when they developed their own homeland, and to make goods and stuff that would sell. So by the time as you get towards the end of Exodus, and also as you look in Numbers, you'll see this wilderness wandering. The traditional place where Moses is said to have received the Ten Commandments is called Jebel Musa, and it's on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Tradition says that. And that's a pretty good idea because Moses was a Kenite, okay? And Kenites are smiths, they're metalsmiths. And in that part of the Sinai Peninsula, there were a lot of mines. So it kind of fits that they may have ended up in a place that Moses was familiar with when they did get the Ten Commandments. So that Israel receives the law, and they really receive the law in two different ways. What are the two ways? They receive part of it by direct command, which would be reflected in the Ten Commandments, okay? And then how else do they receive their law? By the writings of Moses. As they actually travel along, Moses, by divine revelation, is writing what you would call it conditional law, but it's not that it's conditional in nature. It's just that it's introduced according to the conditions. A lot of what Moses wrote was appropriate to that particular moment, okay? I think that his books, as they began, his books were very small, and then as they traveled, they became much bigger, okay, to represent the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible. So, and there's a lot about the similarities between the laws that Moses wrote and the Code of Hammurabi, but really the word, the Ten Commandments in and of themselves are unique, and there's a lot of uniqueness portrayed in all the other laws that Moses wrote down. Now it was really during this wilderness experience that the Jewish people began to focus in on the worship of Yahweh. Okay, it's where it's not that they were always monotheistic, but now they began to focus in, because what is a lot of what Moses is writing? He's telling them how to do what? How to worship. Okay, he's giving them things like the tabernacle. Build this tabernacle. He's giving them things like sacrificing the animals. So he's actually teaching them their, for lack of a better, their denomination almost, okay? taught the law that they're supposed to live by. They're taught how to, a very important part, how to maintain a relationship with God, which is what? How do you maintain a relationship with God? You repent, you confess, you get right with the Lord, okay? And that's the sacrificial system. So they're taught how to establish that system. That system is established, and then they're taught how to maintain it. They're taught about the importance of priests, about sacrifices, tabernacle, the inception of the tribe of Levi. Okay, so a lot of what they're learning here in the wilderness is what they're being taught by Moses, what he's writing down. So we get then to when does the actual, where do we begin the actual conquest of Canaan? Who? Joshua. Joshua begins the conquest. And there's really three, what you would call military campaigns: a central campaign, a southern campaign, and a northern campaign, as they take over different sections of the land of Canaan. And part of what you've got to realize is that, okay, they would go in and beat people up, okay? What did God always tell them to do? Wipe them out. And what did they always do? They always left people behind. You know why? You know why? Well, one of the reasons, of course, God wanted them to wipe them out because they were evil people, and he knew they would influence them. But another reason is they weren't strong enough to hold territory. They weren't a strong enough country yet. They didn't get to be that strong until David's time. Okay, so they weren't strong enough to hold the territory. If they had wiped them out, they wouldn't have to worry about it. But they did. And in fact, they brought a lot of these people under their wing, more or less. So they would gain a piece of territory. They couldn't hold it, so they would move on to a different piece of territory. Joshua was very successful, and when we look at the biblical evidence, we see how successful he was by the archaeological evidence. Foremost in that is Jericho. Okay, the existence of Jericho is a fact. It had walls that were 30 feet high, which is a big wall back in those days. You could drive chariots across back and forth across the wall. That's how they guarded the wall. There's no doubt it was although the critics will say it was conquest. It fell at a different time, but really it fell in reflection of the time of Joshua. Ai, that city, remember him? That guy got in trouble. What was that guy's name? Achan. Achan was Achan because he was lying. Whatever that, some saying like that. That's a city that is assumed, that is a city that assuredly existed. Bethel is another city. All these cities that Joshua had a hand in are all archaeologically proven. As not originally, a lot of them, but as time has progressed, as you've seen, in fact, they're still discovering stuff all the time that proves the validity of the Bible. Okay, never have found anything that doesn't. So when the Hebrews invaded Canaan, the society that they invaded was in many ways a sophisticated society, but it wasn't until, so as they were invading Canaan, it was about another 300 years until they actually dominated this area, militarily and politically, okay? And during that 300 years, they were influenced by these societies, and that's part of the problem that God always had with them, because they kept falling into the same traps over and over. For the Canaanite people, religion was intertwined with their politics, their social order, their economics. As as polytheistic people, they had a God for everything. They had a God for trade, a God for commerce, a God for this, a God for that. So as the Jewish people interacted with them, they were always influenced by this idolatry. And so what you end up with, by the time you end up with this part of the Bible is you have a very mixed group of people. These are in no way a pure race of the descendants of Jacob, okay? This is a very diverse group of people. There's slaves, there's prisoners, there's Midianites, there's Egyptians, there's all sorts of Canaanites. So, and that's part of the problem that David had getting this group of people to function together, because a lot of them were from nomadic tribes, and they wanted to do things their own way. They thought their way was the right way. So, when, you know, what we see then as we leave the time of the conquest is we see a diverse group of people who are just beginning to make their ascent to become a world power, okay? Because David begins that. He finds a city, and he finds a city named Salem, and he makes it Jerusalem. And then as they are able to focus their energies in that area of the world, they become a world power. And then as Solomon takes over, they are recognized as the preeminent power in the world, and that's what we'll look at next week. Questions? Yeah, Larry.
What you say is true about they becoming mixed people. How did they recognize which tribe they were from?
Well, the tribe, after a while, what tribe are they of now?
Judah. Well, I mean...
No, what tribe, which one of the 12 tribes are they of now?
We don't know.
But in the Old Testament, they always
They
went back to...
They associated themselves with different tribes according to how they became associated with the nation. You know, however they were assimilated, that's how they became members of that particular tribe. Now, Levites, I think, you would think they would be pretty, for lack of a better word, pure in their makeup. But most of the tribes, you know, and look where they are now, you know, they don't. So, as time progressed, there was an erosion of, you know, the tribal system as instituted by the board was very prevalent during the wilderness struggle. But as Israel came into Canaan, they lost a lot of their identity. And I think that's part of what some of their identities were lost.
So when Paul said that he was of the tribe of Benjamin, he was just kind of guessing?
No, probably not Paul. But there would be Tom and Sam and Henry. They would have a clue what tribe they were from. I'm not saying all of them.
Oh, so some
I'm just
did.
saying, oh yeah.
Some did.
Just like today, there are Jews that believe they belong to certain tribes, and a lot of them, they may have the old lineage, you know. Like the Hasidics, you know, some of them, I'm not sure what tribe the Hasidics belong to, but, you know, a lot of them are, there's a whole section of Judaism that's into genealogy, just like there is in the Mormon church.
I've heard that the name Cohen, which is a Jewish name, can trace their name directly back to Levi.
Yeah. Well, they all want to. Yeah, a lot of them. Yeah, they all want to. A lot of them. But there isn't a lot of them that, some of the other less glamorous people, they don't want to trace their names back to them.
So how, as that young today is calling people home, how do they know
Well, they have a system in place where, but Israel has had open borders for anyone who professes to be a Jew since their inception. They've always why are they building more settlements? They want more people. Why do they want more people? Because, there's a security in numbers. I've heard that it's working, that there's a lot of people leaving Europe. Because as what you're seeing now in Europe is as the anti-Muslim fever is rising, the anti-Semitic fever is rising. Because really, my belief is, and it's my belief, is that the hinge pin of the false religion in the world in the end times will be Islam. It will become of such a magnitude that it will be I believe that the Antichrist will be the imam that they were trying to call now by a world catastrophe. Yeah, Larry?
Interesting that you bring that up about the Jews coming home, because when I saw that on TV the other day, I remember reading it in Ezekiel, and it's in Ezekiel 36 and then again in 38, where God says that he'll bring his people back to the land, from the north, the south, and east.
Yeah, now some people would say that happened in 1948.
In part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with it, in part, but I think it's being fulfilled now.
But I do believe that you will see a great majority of the Jews in the world, in Israel, during the end time. It only makes sense. That's the way. They will become so isolated as time progresses. Gordon?
Yes, I just recently read a rather lengthy article about the ISIS movement that's going on. And what is the thesis of the whole article was that their network, they're not really a central government, they're networking and returning to original Islam with Muhammad, which was very violent during that time.
Yeah, this is a caliphate. The caliphate at one time stretched from Iran all the way to Spain.
What does that word mean?
It's a word for kingdom.
They're religious leaders, political leaders.
And so their intent is to reestablish the caliphate. And then when they have the caliphate established, they will be able to go and purify the world. Which means kill all the Jews and all the Christians and subject everybody else to their way of life. Convert or die. So that's what the future holds. And you know what our government has said the last 2 days. The number 2 lady at the State Department. She says the way to defeat ISIS is to find jobs for them.
Yeah.
Well, they already have jobs in our government. But can you imagine going into a McDonald's and messing up your order to chop off your head? I'm sorry. I'll go somewhere else and have it my way.